Governance of official corporate policies is an important topic in today's business world, especially when one considers the rapid evolution of business practices, the effect of constantly changing legislation, and proactive risk management that goes along with having a well-established corporate policy governance model. When you consider these requirements, along with the importance of ensuring that corporate policies are properly reviewed, approved, and audited, it makes sense to automate corporate policy approval processes, and this is exactly what this application is intending to do. Consider your own organization's policies when you build this application out. Perhaps these include policies tied to social media usage on company assets, expense claims, acceptable use, and so on. At the high level, we will set up a simple corporate policy approval application with the intent to help employees easily find policies and even contribute to the process of managing them over time. The application will allow any user in the organization to submit a new or updated policy for approval. If that policy is approved, it will be moved to a central library of official corporate policies, and a global notification will be sent out so that everyone in the organization knows about the new policy and has easy access to the latest official version. The application will also allow users to request that certain policies be withdrawn when they are no longer relevant. These types of requests will also be run through an approval process before the policy is withdrawn. Let's begin with the design of this solution by breaking it down into the elements that generally make up a K2 application: workflows, forms, reports, and data. We will use two different workflows for this particular scenario: a corporate policy submission workflow and a corporate policy withdrawal workflow. These workflows will provide the capability for any user in our organization to submit new policies for approval and eventually publishing, as well as allowing any user to request that an existing published policy be withdrawn. Let's look at the workflows themselves in a little more detail. The corporate policy submission workflow will allow any user to submit a policy for approval. The first workflow step in that process will update the document's status property to reflect that it was submitted for approval and is pending review. The next step will be delivered in the form of a user task to the members of an assigned document reviewers group. One of these users can open the document and determine whether it needs rework or can be moved on to a higher approval. If the document requires rework, the system will again update the document status property to reflect this, and then deliver a task to the workflow originator to either rework or cancel the policy submission. If they choose to cancel the submission, the system will update the document status to reflect that it was canceled, and the workflow will end. If they choose to resubmit the document for review, the status is updated accordingly and will circle back to the review policy task. This rework loop can be executed as many times as is necessary until the originator cancels the request or the reviewer sends the document for approval. When the document is sent for approval, the system will update the document status to reflect this and then assign the approved new policy user task to the approver for the current policy type. The interesting thing here is the approver will be looked up from a list in Sharepoint so that the approval task is routed correctly based on the type of policy being submitted. At this stage, the approver may return the document for rework, in which case the same rework loop as before gets kicked off all over again. If the approver rejects the document, the system will update the document's status property accordingly and notify the originator. If the assigned approver approves the document, the system will move the submitted policy to the official corporate policies library, notify the originator of the workflow, and then send out a global notification to let users in the organization know that a new corporate policy has been published. Now we can bring in the requirement for our second workflow called corporate policy withdrawal. Once a policy has been approved and published in the official corporate policies library, any user can request for a policy to be withdrawn. The first step for these requests will prompt the system to set the policy status to indicate that a withdrawal request is pending. As before, the system will use the policy type to determine which user or users needs to approve the withdrawal request. If this user denies the request, the system will just revert the approval status of the policy back to approved and notify the requester that their request to withdraw the policy was denied. If the approver accepts the withdrawal request, the system will delete the policy document from the corporate policies library and send an email notification to the originator of the request. These two workflows make up the bulk of our corporate policy management application. Of course, you may want to take time to design these workflows with additional steps as they apply to your organization. But once you've built out the workflows, you can always go back and add additional steps or reconfigure existing steps as needed. Our recommendation is that you build out the application as prescribed in this guide to get it to a working state and get familiar with the setup before you change anything further. For this workflow design to be effective, we also need forms to capture data. To set this up, we will use K2 generated forms for the user interaction steps in the corporate policy submission workflow. Note that the generated K2 Smart Form forms are not going to be used to start the workflow. Instead, the user will manually initiate the workflows anytime that they like. We are using K2 Smart Forms, though, so that you can change the layout of the form that is used to edit and view the document's properties if you like. We will not actually make any changes to the generated form as part of this build guide, but in the interest of future-proofing your application and making it possible to modify the user interfaces at a later point in time, it's always a good idea to use K2 generated forms from the start for a K2 application. For the corporate policy withdrawal workflow, we will just use the standard Sharepoint forms since there is very little actual user interface requirements in this workflow. It is essentially a one-step approval process that could equally well be completed using email. Let's take a moment to talk about the data sources driving this application that will include a Sharepoint list, 2 document libraries, and a Sharepoint permissions group. The first library is the Corporate Policy Submissions Library, which is used like a staging area for policies that are being edited, reviewed, or approved. Keep in mind, for our application, any user can submit a policy for approval. When a user submits their policy, they will need to select a policy type from a drop-down list so that the policy can be routed to the correct approvers. If and when the policy is approved, the workflow will move the document from this library into another library named Official Corporate Policies Library. We'll take a more in-depth look at these libraries when we build them out here in a few minutes. Along with the libraries, this application will use one Sharepoint list to store and maintain the approvers for each type of policy. For example, HR policies will be approved by Cody, while finance policies will be approved by Bob and Anthony. This list will be used as a lookup in the Corporate Policy Submissions Library when users submit new policies for approval so that the policy can be routed by that workflow to the appropriate approvers for that type of policy. If multiple users are set as the approvers for a policy, both of those users will need to approve the new policy before it can become official. Now, the last element tied to our data design in this application will be a Sharepoint permissions group used for the initial policy review task. We don't want to flood the final policy approvers with invalid or incomplete policies, so the members of this group act as the gatekeepers for any new policy submissions. Feel free to choose your own users for this review group in your environment, but normally this task is performed by members of your human resources or legal teams. In our application, the K2 workflow will just assign the policy review task to the managed members of this group. This approach allows the Sharepoint site owner to modify the members of the group at any time without having to make any changes to the K2 application elements. We only need to require one person in this particular group to review the submitted policy, and they can send it back for rework or accept the policy, after which it will move on to the approval step. Let's get started with the corporate policy submission process by opening up the Corporate Policy Submissions Library and upload our new document. I've called this document Sample Policy Document Demo for our video here. The next thing I'll do is fill in the properties as follows. I'm going to enter in Sample Policy Demo for the title. For description, I'll enter in this is a sample policy used for demonstration purposes. And finally, I'll use the HR type here, which will eventually send an approval request to the assigned policy type approver for HR, which in my case is Cody in my environment. And now I'll save it back to Sharepoint. Because the K2 service account running the workflow will need access to this document when the workflow runs, I'll need to check the document in before starting the corporate policy submission workflow. I can do this by clicking on the context menu for this document select Check-in, and I'll go ahead and leave the comments blank for now and just click OK. Let's move on and start the policy submission workflow. Again, I'll click on the context menu option for this document, then select the K2 Workflows item from the menu, and from the K2 Workflow page, we can select the Corporate Policy Submission workflow. Then click the Start button to kick it off. I'll give it a few seconds to kick off, then we can refresh the library view from the browser. After refreshing the browser, notice we can see that the policy status column is set to Submitted for Review. This works because I added an Update Document Properties workflow step at the beginning of the process when I designed it, which was configured to write back information in this column, thus giving feedback to our users as the process runs. Now let's use the K2 Workflows context menu option again and verify that the corporate policy submission workflow has started from a reporting point of view. We can see that there is a reported instance of the workflow currently running against this document under the Workflow History section inside K2's out-of-box reporting options that we enabled for this process. If you're interested in knowing who's assigned to the review task for this process at this point in time, we can use the View Flow link right here to find the names of those individuals who need to review the document. I'll open that view up in my browser, and then I'll select the Review New Policy icon here in the workflow graphic. We can see that John, Julie, and the admin account are all assigned to this task since they are members of a Sharepoint Policy Reviewers group that was used to configure the participants for this particular task. To work this assignment as one of these participants, I'll go ahead and open Julie's email application in my environment. There should be an email message from K2 asking her to review the submitted document. A quick mental note, the policy review task will also be available on the K2 work list when assigned reviewers open the SharePoint site landing page for this application, as you can see here. Heading back over to the email client, I'll click on the work item link in the email message, which should open the K2 form to work this assigned review task. Notice we have all the entered information for this policy document from the data source as well as a link to the document. At this point, let's select the Return for Rework action and then submit the form back to K2. This is going to send a task back to the workflow originator and notify this person that he or she needs to fix the document before it can be sent on for approval by the policy type approver. Having done this, let's flip back to the Corporate Policy Submissions library to look at the document status column. From our point of view, we can see that the policy status was set to Rework Required. Now, I'll go back to the landing page of my site to check the K2 work list. Let's verify that as the requester, we received a task to rework the document and either resubmit it or cancel the submission. Looks like we do have an assigned rework task waiting here. In this case, I'll open the form up and I'll resubmit the document for approval. Next, I'll jump over to a browser for one of the reviewers identified in the previous step again. In this case, I'll open up Julie's browser to the application's landing page. Then I'll open her Review New Policy task from the K2 work list and select the Send for Approval action on the task form to move it on to the policy type approver. Before moving on to the next phase, I want to jump back over to the Corporate Policy Submissions library. I'll open the K2 Workflows context menu option for the submitted policy document, and then I'm going to use the Workflow History and View Flow report to verify that the document is now waiting at the approval step of the workflow. Inside this report, we can use the Participants tab to determine who needs to approve this policy. In my example, the user assigned to this task is Cody, since Cody is the approver for HR policies. With Cody's browser opened up to her email client, we have the message she has received asking her to approve this document now. We can use K2 Smart Actions in this email message to reply and close out this task. To demonstrate how this works, I'll reply to the email with the approved action. Doing this allows us to complete this task without having to open a form, which comes in handy if you're away from your computer or office in a mobile situation. Now, after a few seconds, we should see a confirmed email message come back to this approver that the approval task has been completed. I'll pause the video here for a few seconds to preserve time. Great, you can see the response from K2 here as it appears in Cody's inbox, indicating that the policy document has been approved. Let's browse over to the official corporate policies library and verify that our policy document was indeed moved to this library. It looks good here. Let's also verify that the title, description, policy type, and approval date values were populated correctly. These values look good as they are matching up with what we entered in for this document at the beginning of our demo. Notice that the history column has a link in it now. Let's click on this link for the policy in this history column and review the view flow report. For audit purposes, we can check the Participants tab for the Review New Policy step, and we can also check the Approve New Policy step to see which approvers reviewed and approved the new policy as it came into this library. Now let's quickly go back to our email client as the requester to verify that we received a notification that our submitted policy was approved. The link in the email should also take us here to the official corporate policies library where that document landed. Okay, great, it looks like that works. Lastly, we can verify that the general notification email was sent out to notify all users about the new policy by going back to Cody's email view. There's the global message. Let's quickly check that the link in the email opens the approved policy document. That looks good too. From this point, we can move over and walk through the other half of this solution where we withdraw a corporate policy that has been approved and released. Starting inside the official corporate policies library, let's open the context menu for the policy that was just approved, then select K2 Workflows to open up the K2 Workflow related window for this specific document. Let's go ahead and start the corporate policy withdrawal workflow at this point. When a withdrawal request comes in, it will actually be sent back to the approver we assigned to the policy type of the document. In the case of this document, the approver for the HR policy type is Cody, so I'll do this as Cody in my environment by switching to her email client again. And then I'm going to reply to the message with an approve withdrawal action and send it off. Before we move on, let's wait for K2 to respond that it has received this message to complete the task for Cody. Okay, there's our message. Now let's return to the official corporate policies library and verify that the policy document has been deleted. Upon refreshing the library page, it looks like our policy has been removed from the library. We can also review the workflow history information about this remove process we just ran by looking at the K2 reports we configured back in our build step of the workflow when we designed it. You can open the K2 report page for this library from the K2 group of buttons in the library tab at the top of the page. Notice that we have some instance information listed in the workflows bar chart. I'll go ahead and click on the instance that we just ran to populate the workflow instances report here on the right, and then I'll open the ViewFlow report to review the workflow history for this corporate policy withdrawal workflow. In doing this, we can see who approved the withdrawal of this policy and when they actioned it in the system, as you can see here. This concludes the demonstration of the corporate policy management solution. We hope you have enjoyed this demonstration, and the next step, if you'd like to run with it, is to go through the build guide for this solution and build it inside your own environment.